Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to today's Fieldfisher webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Flick. I'm a partner based out here in our Silicon Valley office, and I'm delighted to say I'm joined by my colleagues Megan and Imogen. And we wanted to do this webinar because there has been an absolute deluge, some might say tsunami, of new digital regulation that Europe has been pushing out. So much so that it's a huge amount to keep on top of, and to understand how to kind of understand who it applies to what extent we need to be keeping in mind these new regulations as you map out your compliance projects for this year. So we're here to give you a really practical overview of the new pieces of legislation that are coming into effect this year or are due to come into effect in the next kind of 1 to 2 years, to give you and help you inform your kind of prioritization when you're building out that compliance program for 2024. We're going to try and use a kind of we're going to apply chilies to the different pieces of legislation, basically to tell you how hot or not we think they are, and how much we think you need to take them into account now, or maybe to the extent you can sort of delay factoring them into your compliance for this year. So with that all said, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about.
Okay, so we're going to cover a number of initiatives today. As you can see on the slide, we've got Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Data Governance Act, Data Act, and the AI Act. So a whole load of acronyms there. But all these initiatives are part of Europe's digital decade. And back in March 2021, the European Commission presented its vision for Europe's digital transformation by 2030. And the Commission intended to fund and support the development of sectors that are crucial to its digital sovereignty, while also promoting common EU values and respecting fundamental rights and freedoms, including privacy, safety, and security. But with every ambitious plan follows a whole host of challenges to overcome and a raft of regulations to navigate.
Okay, so to keep things interesting and provide you with a realistic assessment of what's hot and what's not in EU digital regulation, we've created a key to indicate the levels of spiciness for each piece of legislation, and therefore where your compliance efforts should be focused. So at the one chili end, we have the least spicy regulations. And not to say these aren't important, but the key measures introduced by these regulations won't affect many of you. At the medium spice level, we have those regulations where there's a lot to get on top of, but there is plenty of time to prepare. And lastly, we have the spiciest of the regulations. They're just about to come into effect. There's a whole host of obligations to get your head around, and so the need to act now and prepare early is paramount to ensure compliance. So first up is the Digital Services Act. Now, as those of you who tune into Fieldfisher's webinars regularly will know, we've just recently hosted an entire webinar just on the DSA. Are you subject to the DSA? What are your responsibilities as a hosting service or an online platform? And how will the DSA affect your business model? All of these questions have been answered, so please do check it out. But at a very high level, the DSA aims to protect users online by making it easier for them to flag hate speech, terrorist propaganda, child pornography, and other illegal content, goods, and services. It also updates the liability regime for digital service providers and creates new takedown, transparency, and reporting obligations. This includes requirements to provide users with information about why ads are shown and information about why content is recommended. The DSA also introduces new obligations for intermediary services, and these are tiered depending on the nature, size, and impact of the service. So, for example, mere conduits, caching services, and hosting services are subject to rather limited obligations, while online platforms, online search engines, and online marketplaces are subject to additional obligations. The most onerous obligations are reserved for very large online platforms and very large online service providers, including obligations to perform risk assessments and conduct yearly audits. So the first port of call with the DSA will be to assess quickly whether you are caught, which category you fall under, and what the relevant obligations are for your organisation. So moving on to our next EU digital regulation, the Digital Markets Act. The main purpose of the DMA is to put an end to unfair practices by companies that act as gatekeepers in the online economy. These gatekeepers are primarily large digital platforms that provide an important gateway between business users and consumers, and whose position can grant them the power to act as a private rule maker, therefore creating a bottleneck in the digital economy. So really, this is unlikely to apply to many of you listening today, but we're including here for completeness, and so we have 0 chilies here on our heat scale. Only 7 companies have actually notified the European Commission that they meet the criteria of gatekeeper, including Google, Amazon, Apple, TikTok, Meta, Microsoft, and Samsung, all the usual suspects.
So our next digital regulation is the Data Governance Act. And essentially, the DGA regulates the sharing of both personal and non-personal data held by public sector bodies that's subject to the rights of others. And when we're talking about the rights of others, we're talking about trade secrets, personal data, or IP rights. The DGA intends to facilitate the reuse of public sector data by ensuring no business suffers from any discrimination when accessing data they would like to reuse. And it prevents public sector bodies from entering into exclusive agreements relating to the reuse of that data. The rules under the DGA became applicable on 24th of September last year, and most of the provisions only apply to public sector bodies. There are some rules applicable to data intermediation service providers, or data intermediaries, and that is an organisation which sets up commercial arrangements between those holding the data and those wishing to use the data. And providers likely to be within scope are data marketplaces, consent management platforms, and services set up to be the middleman between data subjects who want to make their personal data available and data users who want to use their personal data. Now, the DGA specifically excludes from scope, amongst others, providers of cloud services, data brokers, and providers of products resulting from value add to the data by that service provider. So if you're caught as a data intermediary, the DGA sets up a 2-tier licensing regime with certain licensing conditions designed to ensure that the data intermediary's independence and restrict their reuse of data. And in addition, data intermediaries will need to consider if third countries offer appropriate protections for the non-personal data and need to resist government access to EU data. So it's essentially creating a set of data transfer restrictions for non-personal data. There's also a notification and registration process for data intermediaries with the local authority. Now, that all said, given its limited application to most of our clients, we've given the DGA a mild 1 chili here.
Thanks, Megan. So sitting alongside the Data Governance Act is something called the EU Data Act. And its main purpose is really to create a framework for who can access and use data generated by connected products and related digital services. In other words, it kind of clarifies who can create value from data and under what conditions. And the idea behind this act was really to try and unlock the data companies that have access to this data, to unlock that data and allow it to be used and accessed by both the users, so the people whose data it includes, and also other third-party recipients. And much like the Data Governance Act, it also covers both personal and non-personal data. So unlike the GDPR, which is focused on the processing of personal data, lots of these new digital pieces of regulation that we're looking at extend to other sets of data too. So who really needs to be concerned about this? Well, the Data Act primarily applies to manufacturers, suppliers and users of connected products in the EU, as well as kind of related services. And it potentially covers a broad range of products from vehicles, medical devices, lifestyle equipment, consumer goods. There are also certain provisions that apply to data holders that make data available to data recipients in the EU. So that could include the manufacturer, but it could also include providers of related services or even external cloud service providers. There are also provisions that are around public sector bodies and requiring that they share data or have access to data in certain situations. And probably most notable for many of our clients are actually the provisions that apply to data processing services, i.e. providers of cloud services in the EU. And I'll come on to that in a second. So this is a really new piece of legislation. It entered into force on the 11th of January this year, but most of the provisions won't apply until the 25th of September 2025, and there are some other provisions which will take effect even later. So what are the key obligations? Well, if you are a manufacturer of a connected product, you will have to be ensuring that they are designed and manufactured in a way that empowers users, which could be businesses or consumers, to easily and securely access, use, and share product data and related service data. And the intention here is that historically data generated by connected products, so think about your smart home devices and other things, were exclusively harvested by that manufacturer. So they had a lot of control over the data that was being generated from your use of those connected products. And that was felt to have given them a really unfair competitive advantage and left consumers with limited choices with respect to things like aftermarket services. So getting repair or other types of services from other providers. So by imposing obligations to make that product data and related service data accessible to the users, so the businesses or consumers that are using those products, it really aims to create a more sort of competitive market and give consumers the benefit of certain choice. So the Act includes specific measures that allow users to gain access to their data that was connected by the products, and also to share data with third parties, again, to provide aftermarket or other data-driven innovative services. And there are a few exceptions baked into that. So this is kind of somewhat like the GDPR right of portability. There are also obligations imposed on third parties who will be receiving that data. For example, they will be subject to sort of purpose limitation requirements, so only allowed to process that data they receive for purposes that have been agreed with the user. There are also a number of unfair terms related provisions that sort of cover that data access. So the Act outlines when certain contractual terms between the different organisations who share data under the Act will be deemed to be unfair. So again, going to have some implications there between the contracts that are in place to facilitate those data sharing arrangements, essentially to kind of protect against an imbalance between the parties. And then those data holders are going to be required to make certain data available free of charge to public sector organisations where there is an exceptional need, a public interest argument. And then I think probably of most interest to our clients is the new provisions that apply that sort of facilitate or aimed at facilitating easier switching between cloud and edge services. So there are going to be new rules which allow customers to more easily switch between different data processing providers without undue delay or cost, and to port their data and digital assets to another provider or to port it to their own infrastructure. Again, the intention here is to remove obstacles, whether pre-commercial, technical or contractual, which inhibit customers from doing things like terminating the contract, engaging another provider, porting the customers' exportable data and digital assets to new providers or to their own on-prem infrastructure. So to kind of bolster all of that switching, the Act sets out certain minimum contractual requirements that are going to have to be put in place to support the switching between the services. And those cloud service providers are also going to have certain transparency obligations, which will require it to make available certain information on that, about how the switching can take place, amongst other things. So quite a bit there if you're a cloud service provider that's caught by the Act. There's also, much like Megan hinted at in the Data Governance Act, we're also seeing an extension of some of the data transfer rules to non-personal data. So really extending the transfer rules under the GDPR and Schrems II, the Schrems II decision, to providers of data processing services. And they are essentially going to be required to make sure that they're implementing appropriate safeguards to prevent any incompatible or unlawful access to that personal data, I should say, not just personal data, by governments. So what are the kind of next steps here? Well, if you're a manufacturer or a data holder of a connected product, you're really going to bear the bulk of the compliance obligations under this Act. So you're going to have to implement design requirements, get to know your data, start classifying data, both non-personal and personal data, to figure out what data sets you're going to have to potentially make available to the users. It's going to have an impact on data licensing terms, and you're also going to have to be ready to manage and respond to some of these access and portability requests that the Data Act facilitates. And then if you're a cloud provider, you're also going to have to think about updating your contracts to factor in the minimum contractual requirements that apply under the Act, and also be aware of some of those international transfer requirements. And if you're a data recipient looking to kind of get the value of some of the data that can be released from these connected products, and you may have a chance to profit from some of that data, there's going to have to be appropriate data licensing terms that are put in place to govern that sharing. So quite a bit to think about. I think for most of our clients, the real sort of area where you're going to be caught is if you're a cloud service provider and your kind of processing falls within the scope there, and it's really going to have impacts for contractual arrangements that you have with your customers, the users of those products. So next slide, please. So this has been the headline grabbing piece of new legislation that has in many ways dwarfed all other legislations in terms of interest amongst consumers, amongst regulators and such like, and even just the general legal community, and that's the EU AI Act. And it deserves to have got this much attention. It's really a landmark piece of legislation because it's the first attempt that we've seen globally to implement a kind of attempt to regulate AI. There are obviously initiatives that are happening in other places in the world, but this is really sort of the first attempt that we've seen to horizontally regulate all AI systems. And so there is an expectation that we may see something of the Brussels effect with this act. It may, inspire other regimes or at least set a benchmark for what needs to be in place when we are developing and designing and using AI systems. So some of you may have seen the excitement in January. We got an unofficial leaked version of the text that had been provisionally agreed in December. Last Friday, the exciting news was that Act was finally approved, and we have seen the final approved version now published. And we expect the Act to really come into force probably in Q2. The formal adoption vote is provisionally scheduled for the 10th or 11th of April. And after that vote happens, it should be published in the official journal and then trigger the implementation periods under the Act. So, and I'll talk a little bit about those, but spoiler alert, there is going to be quite potentially a bit of time there for organisations who are caught to comply. So who really needs to be paying attention to this Act? Well, at its heart, this is really a product safety and product liability piece of legislation. And so most of the responsibilities and obligations fall on the providers, i.e. the developers of AI systems that are high risk. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. And more generally, it applies a risk-based approach to regulating AI systems. So as I say, we've got certain certain AI systems that are going to be absolutely banned outright. And those provisions and that section of the Act is actually going to come into effect the most quickly. So we'll see those prohibited AI systems, you're going to not be able to use those within 6 months of the Act coming into effect. And then we've got certain provisions, as I mentioned, that are designed to regulate what we call high-risk AI systems. And these are where the bulk of the obligations are going to apply. And they're going to apply, as I say, principally to the providers, i.e. the developers of those AI systems. So think Google, Microsoft, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, those guys, and more. There's also going to be transparency and other specific requirements for what we call general purpose AI models, including foundation models and generative AI. And then kind of moving down the tier of risk, there's going to be provisions that or regulation that applies to any AI systems that interact with people. So think chatbots, and they'll be subject to certain transparency obligations. But then other AI systems are not really subject to substantive requirements under the Act. As I say, the bulk of them are going to hit the high risk AI systems. So with that said, what is a prohibited system and what's a high risk system? So we've done extensive, or the Fieldfisher team have done extensive webinars that go into real detail into the provisions of the AI Act, which I really encourage you to listen to. The most recent one was kind of done, I think, on a couple of weeks ago, and we'll provide links to those in the notes for this session. But broadly speaking, the prohibited AI systems include certain AI systems for biometric categorization and identification, including those for untargeted scraping of facial data from the internet. So think Clearview and that mass scraping of images to build a biometric database that's going to be used to kind of categorize people based on things like sensitive grounds. It also includes AI systems that deploy subliminal, what the Act refers to as subliminal techniques, or exploits vulnerabilities or manipulates human behavior to circumvent fundamental rights or cause physical or psychological damage. Quite a broad and potentially ambiguous reference there, but I think this is really trying to capture things like, creepy toys that might include AI systems that are there to sort of deceive children in some manipulative way. It also includes AI systems for emotion recognition in law enforcement or for workplace and education. Those are banned. Also banned are AI systems for social scoring, evaluation, or classification of people or groups over a period of time based on their social behavior. So this is really kind of looking to China and other places where we've seen some fairly aggressive and intrusive social scoring that's done on people there with real negative consequences for them. So those will be banned, and clearly if you're doing or have an AI system that you're developing or using that falls within any of those banned prohibited lists or types, then that's something you're going to have to act quickly to stop doing. But really where the focus of this regulation is really regulating those high-risk AI systems. And that includes products that are already subject to existing product safety legislation. So again, toys, vehicles, aeroplanes, things like that. So if you've got an AI system that's embedded in any of those types of products or forms a part of the safety component for those products, then it's going to be deemed a high-risk AI system. But it also includes AI systems that are used for sort of critical infrastructure like water, gas and electricity, or used to determine access to education systems. I think most notably, and one where it may catch a lot of our clients, is potentially the bucket of AI systems used in recruitment and employment. So if your system is being used or designed to help with the placing of job ads or scoring candidates or reviewing job applications, that is going to be deemed a high risk system. Both as if you're a developer and then if you're a user of that system, you're going to have certain transparency obligations. And then AI systems that are used for law enforcement, asylum and border control type scenarios, or for influencing the outcome of democratic elections or processes, or used in insurance and banking sectors. So it's not a closed list, and it could be supplemented in the future as we get guidance and other sort of outcomes that come from the regulators. But I think it's fair to say that a number of those high risk use cases probably don't capture a large number of organizations directly as developers, unless you're designing, which I think which is going to capture the most people, those systems that are involved in recruitment and employment. So that might give some comfort to those who are a little bit scared that the EU AI Act is going to directly grab them. I think you need to be mindful of the fact it's really only capturing those high-risk AI systems, and then those who are using those systems are subject to obligations, but they're slightly more light touch. So if you are designing, using a high-risk system, lots to do there. You're going to have to put in place risk management systems, data governance measures there'll be technical documentation requirements, record keeping requirements, as well as transparency requirements. And then you'll also be subject to various procedural obligations around ensuring that you've got CE markings, that you're registering your system in a database, as well as certain reporting obligations. So lots to do if you're caught, less so if you're not caught as a high risk system. The other sort of area which I think is going to catch a few people is, or a number of organizations, is the provisions which regulate general purpose AI. So this is really trying to capture your foundation models, the generative AI, and that's going to be subject to a number of obligations. If you are a developer of those systems, you're going to have to meet certain transparency requirements. There is extra obligations for those systems, those general purpose AI systems that involve systematic risk. They're going to be subject to more stringent model evaluation requirements, risk assessment requirements, as well as certain cybersecurity and energy efficiency requirements. So quite a lot to do there. So as I said, we wanted to give you a quick overview in this session, but we encourage you, if you want more detail, to go and really listen to some of our more detailed webinars on the EU AI Act. It's a beast of a legislation. It's over 258 pages, so more than we can cover it in this session today. Hopefully that gives you a good sense there. And the reason we've given it 2 chilies is because a number of the provisions are really going to only apply after 2 years after the law comes into effect. So really we're looking at 2026 for lots of the substantive provisions to start to kick in and regulate those high risk systems, and even 36 months from for some other high risk systems. If you're a provider of a general purpose AI system, you've got a little less time. You've got a year to get up to compliance, but everybody else in that high risk bucket has got between 24 and 36 months to get their compliance up to speed. So absolutely not a piece of law to be ignored. It's got some really far-reaching consequences, potentially those who are involved in processing that hits or is implicated with high risk providers of high risk systems and such like. But we've got a bit of time to comply there. And we're also waiting on quite a lot of extra guidance and codes of conduct that we're expected to be released under the Act, which will hopefully help organisations kind of navigate what they need to do to comply with this legislation.
Okay, so we can't not mention the UK's digital regulation development, so we're not going to spend too much time on them here. There are lots of initiatives out there, but there are only a few that are or have recently pushed through the legislative process, and it's questionable whether others will make it through the next round of elections in the UK. So the key one to keep in mind is the Online Safety Act, and my colleagues have recorded a podcast on the OSA recently, which you can find on our Bite Size Legal Updates channel, which is well worth a listen for more detail on this. But in a nutshell, the UK's OSA finally entered into force in October last year and aims to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online by curtailing illegal content, protecting children from online harm, and giving adults more choice over what they see online. Now, the OSA doesn't bring a sudden influx of regulatory changes. Relatively few of the provisions come into force immediately, but it marks the beginning of a long process. Ofcom, the UK regulator, will be implementing the OSA in phases, and it's published its roadmap for that. The first phase of the implementation will be on illegal harms, and during each phase, Ofcom will be consulting on draft guidance and codes of practice before each set of codes is approved by Parliament. So if you're caught as an in-scope service for that, it's one to keep an eye on as those consultations and guidance are announced. And speaking of consultations, just this week, the UK government announced their response to their AI consultation, which opened last May. It doesn't reveal anything concrete as such yet, and there were added questions to the consultation. But the response did indicate that key regulators, so that's Ofcom, Competition and Market Authority, and the ICO, should publish their plans on how they will comply with the government's AI white paper, which previously set out different principles for AI governance, by the end of April. So more guidance to keep an eye on for that, but no immediate action required.
So the key takeaway of this webinar is it's spicy out there, but we have varying levels of heat. So it's important to plan your EU digital agenda accordingly. You can prepare now by ensuring good data privacy hygiene and bolstering your compliance programs.
Well, thanks for tuning in. We've referenced a number of our podcasts and webinars, particularly the OSA one, DSA webinar, and the EU AI Act one. You can find those over on our YouTube channel, and the podcast you can find by searching Bite-Sized Legal Updates or Fieldfisher Data and Digital on your usual podcast channel. Next up in March, we've got a webinar which will be me again, to be hearing my voice again, my colleague Moira, and that will be on employee monitoring trends and risks. So you keep an eye out for that. And otherwise, thanks for listening. Hope you all have a good day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.